Ladies and gentlemen, what I'll do is, yet again, it's the afternoon. All of us seem a little taken back by the weather. That's not a problem. Let's raise each other's energies. And I will come to the center. I'll do a big namaskar to all of you. And please, with your energetic best, do a namaskar back to me in the JLF tradition, right? So, namaskar. Thank you. Lovely. Thank you for your support. Welcome to the 15th edition of the Jaipur Literature Festival, protected by Dettol, Banega Swasth India. And we are at the front lawn for the session, The Struggle and the Promise. It's a book launch. Naushad Forbes in conversation with Navdeep Suri. What is India's future? I deeply believe in India's promise, in our potential for great achievement. I am also old enough to appreciate our ability to snatch failure from the jaws of success. In The Struggle and the Promise, Naushad D. Forbes answers some of the most critical questions concerning India's progress. How can the government, citizens, and firms turn our struggle into a promise and enable India to lead? Can we fix things by learning from the best practices elsewhere? How can we ensure openness, inclusivity, and innovation? How can independent institutions make up for low state capacity? How can our culture deliver leadership? Naushad D. Forbes, in conversation with Navdeep Suri, provides a logical, actionable blueprint for getting the balance right between industry, institutions, and policy. May I now invite Sanjoy Roy to please introduce the session further. All right. Naushad Forbes' book, The Struggle and the Promise, Restoring India's Potential, is being released by HarperCollins. He has co-authored From Followers to Leaders, Managing Technology and Innovation in Newly Industrializing Countries. Forbes is also the co-chairman of Forbes Marshall, India's leading steam engineering and control instrumentation firm, and the chairman of Ananta Aspen Center for Technology, Innovation, and Economic Research. Ladies and gentlemen, Naushad D. Forbes in conversation with Navdeep Suri, being introduced by Sanjoy Roy.
Thank you so much, Rachel. One of the reasons I just wanted to say a few words in the beginning is that in today's context, when you're looking at this, the glowing future of India, 5 trillion, 10 trillion economy, and you look at the GDP forecasts, and you look at the stock exchange, and you look at development, many of the questions that remain unanswered is, so how are we going to get there? And if we get there, who is it that is going to get there? Will it be an inclusive growth? Will we be able to take together all the people of India, especially those who still live in great deprivation? What are the issues that we struggle with in terms of getting to this 5 or 10 trillion? Even as you read reports that the ease of doing business is easier, in actuality, on the ground, it's hardly so. Corruption still exists at every possible level. And for young entrepreneurs, and Indians are going to be the largest number of people on this planet by 2030, with a very young demographic. And these young people are innovators. Jugaad has been our sentiment, but can we turn Jugaad from make do to make possible and arrive at a collective dream where a million fireflies and a million ideas rise into the night sky and illuminate all of us, not just us in India, but across the world. And that, in many ways, is what this absolutely seminal must-read book is about. And I'd like to thank Naushad for making the effort and putting so much of thought into this wonderful book. It's important because these are questions that haven't been asked. He has presented ideas of the way possible. And you're going to hear Navdeep Suri and Naushad Forbes unravel some of what is in his book. But I would recommend it to every policymaker or anybody who's an innovator or has a dream for a better future and a better India. On that note, let me invite Naushad Forbes and Navdeep Suri to unveil the book on this occasion at the Jaipur Literature Festival 15th edition.
you, Sanjay. And Naushad, reading this book, I came away with two quick impressions. One, it's brilliant for the rigor that you've put in, the fact that you've taken the trouble not only to identify key questions, but also to identify answers for the key questions. So it isn't just an academic exercise, it is with that experience of the practitioner. The second thought was it's a brave book because I am utterly unfamiliar with the optics of a serious businessman criticizing government. And you've stuck your neck out by expressing yourself on the manner in which the second wave of COVID was handled, the severity of the lockdown, the impact of the demonetization on the economy, and so on. So it's quite remarkable that you've taken that bold route to express yourself. But let me try and put you on the spot after saying those nice things. You said that the economy had been moving in the right direction till 2017. And then there's been a lapse and perhaps even a regression of sorts in the path of economic reforms that successive governments had pursued from 1991 all the way to 2017. What prompts you to say that?
Thank you, Navdeep. It's wonderful to be here, wonderful to be at JLF as always, and really compliments to the organizers for ending, I hope, the restrictions on our movement that we've all suffered from over these last 2 years. I said that for a very simple reason. I believe that while our progress was not without steps along the way, it wasn't that we didn't trip from time to time, but the progress from 1991 to 2017, I think only took India to a better place. We were in a better place socially, we were in a better place economically. I think in 2007, from 2017 onwards, a couple of things changed, especially on the economic side. The first thing that changed was that we became less open in trade terms. We started raising tariffs on many items. We raised tariffs on over 3,000 items, about half of all of our imports. And between 2017 and really 2021, we saw this increasing, in us becoming increasingly close to the world. And I think that was a mistake because, and we can talk about why later on. In the last year, we've seen some of that change. And I think we've become more pro-free trade agreements. We've become more pro-trade, at least in our public statements, which I think is encouraging. And I hope that that slight reversal that we've seen in this last year grows and gains momentum. The second thing that changed was that in 2017, we started again according greater discretion to bureaucrats. We increased the power of lower level bureaucrats to mount raids, for example, lower level bureaucrats to open investigations. That to me was a mistake. I think we'd seen right through to 2017 an improvement in restricting bureaucratic discretion, in opening things up to more private enterprise. And I think that changed in 2017. So those are the two things that I think contributed to this change in direction.
So what you're saying is that hopefully there is some kind of a course correction, perhaps from 2021 onwards, because
on the trade front.
On the trade front, but we've also seen perhaps a far more clear articulation from the Prime Minister about the role of government or the role of state in business, where I think since the 1956 industrial policy, perhaps for the first time, we have said very clearly from the highest level that the government is not in the business of business.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's very encouraging. And I think the privatization of Air India, which finally went through, was also very encouraging. And I think if those start becoming a movement, and if some of the statements that have been made, the maximum governance, minimum government slogan, if that starts getting practiced in actual policy making on the ground, that will be hugely liberating and powerful for the country.
True, but some of this regulatory overhang also impacts ease of doing business. And while the government has claimed credit for rising in the World Bank's and the World Economic Forum's rankings, you say quite clearly that the impact is not really felt on the ground. And the Observer Research Foundation, where I currently spend some time, recently did this stunning report called Jailed for Doing Business, and identified 26,134 separate clauses in various laws for which an entrepreneur can be jailed.
Yeah, that's exactly my point. I mean, that you need to decriminalize civil offenses. I mean, it just makes no sense, that economic offenses should become offenses where an entrepreneur can go to jail after being proven guilty, not before.
And when we talk about ease of doing business, again, we see that the Department of Industry has announced a new single window scheme. Now, I've been following the economy for about 30 years fairly closely, and I think we've created enough single windows to have a Hawa Mahal sort of structure.
So you're quite right. I mean, I talk about the ease of doing business rankings in the book, and there are two things that we did. One is that we very consciously and systematically said we would move up the rankings, and to some extent, like many other countries too, we weren't unique in this. We sort of gamed the system because, for example, one of the 6 criteria is the ease of getting a power connection, and it's measured only in Mumbai and in Delhi. So we improved the ease with which you could get a power connection in Mumbai and Delhi, and that moves you up the rankings significantly. Now, that's something that lots of countries do. It's too bad because it actually doesn't reflect any improvement in the business environment. The second thing we did, which was much more productive, is we tried to create some competitive federalism. And we tried to unleash one state competing with the other in improving its business environment. That, I think, has been much more productive. And if we take it to its logical conclusion, it can be very powerful because at the end of the day, you don't just do business in India, you do business in Rajasthan, you do business in Maharashtra, you do business in Punjab. And it's that combination of local, state, and national that ultimately makes for a business environment.
So that comment about the federal structure and states competing with each other is interesting. I belong to Punjab, and for a while I was associated with a process on ease of doing business and attracting foreign investment into Punjab. And the government in Punjab would say quite openly that we have the best set of incentives of any state to attract investment. And to me, when I looked at those incentives, it seemed a bit like a race to the bottom because at the end of the day, one, they're going to come from a very limited tax kitty. And the second is, unless they are matched by administrative efficiency, if the rent seeking and corruption continue, then the ease of doing business. So how do you measure that as a metric? The states like to tout their incentives and their maybe online applications, but on the ground, like the French say, le plus ça change, le plus c'est le même.
So, when the year that I was president of CI, I used to go around to all these state investment summits, and they're deadly dull affairs, especially the inaugural function. And they're deadly dull affairs because first of all, they usually last for about 3 or 4 hours. They consist of ministers making speeches, but much more than that, many, many industrialists making speeches. And the industrialists making speeches all get up and talk about how that state is the best, most wonderful state in which one should do business. You learn nothing from those 3 to 4 hours. I believe very much that incentives can at best make up for higher costs of doing business. But when you start trying to compete on the basis of incentives, it's a race to the bottom. If you compete on the ease of doing business, it's much more powerful. So if you can actually compete on, look, you can get a license much faster. You can get permission to actually start manufacturing faster. You can get, we have a rigorous pollution control mechanism, but it's transparent and honest, and you can get it quickly. Those are the things that can, I think, ultimately matter in determining the ease with which you can do business, the cost of actually doing business, not incentives. I think incentives are a short-run solution. I'd much rather see us address more fundamental competitiveness for industry.
Yeah, and I think the reason it really matters is I was in UAE as ambassador, and about a year back, UAE started a golden visa scheme. And it's actually pretty shocking to see how many serious businessmen have moved to Dubai over the last year, or how many have taken the golden visa to keep that option open. And I think, we diplomats are often given the task of attracting foreign direct investment, but to see investment leave the shores not because these are attractive opportunities, but because of the threat that overhangs is a scary proposition.
So, I have a mixed view on this. And my mixed view is as follows. Whatever our concerns may be, and I think we have many very legitimate concerns about the direction that we've taken in recent years in terms of restrictions on what we can, say, a certain worry about public criticism and so on. We have a lot more freedom today than one has in the UAE, than one has in many other countries that we see as attractive places for Indian industrialists to actually go and establish homes. So whatever people are doing, they're not going there for freedom. They're going there maybe because economically it's a more attractive place, or it's a better place for them to send their kids to school or something like that. But it's not political freedom that they're after. I wouldn't go to the Middle East for political freedom.
Sure, absolutely.
Yeah.
We've just had this round of elections, and one of the themes that kept echoing throughout the campaigns was jobs, jobs, jobs. And there's real concern about jobless growth or economic growth that is not producing enough jobs. And there's almost this expectation as if the government will create jobs. And it begs the question of expectation versus reality. Are expectations inflated? Are we overestimating the capacity of government? How do you see that?
Well, in the book, I say that the most dangerous question that we can possibly ask in India is, what is the government doing? Because if we ask that question, it might actually choose to do something. And our expectation should actually be that the government does less, right? And by doing fewer things, it does them a lot better. And there are some essential things that the government should be doing. We should be investing in public health. I think our experience in these last 2 years says that we really need to invest a lot more in public health, union government, especially state governments. We should be doing a lot more in terms of investments in education. We should be doing a lot better in terms of affording good quality criminal justice across all parts of society. We should be doing a lot better in terms of how our police and our courts work. We can do better also, as I say, in terms of financial regulation and the tax system. But that's it. That's where we should be doing a better job. right? We should not, when Jet Airways fails or Kingfisher fails, and you say, what's the government doing? Well, the right answer is the government should be doing nothing. This is a private airline. It's owned by private shareholders. If the business fails, what role does the government have in anything with regard to that private company? And that's the message. That's the point of the book, that listen, do fewer things. By doing fewer things, do them a lot better. And for the rest, get out of the way.
Absolutely. You make this very strong case of economic conservatism, of recognizing that the capacity of the state is limited. And, you bring up this point about a flailing state. And I want to read a little passage from your book.
Lon Pritchett's
yes,
term.
It's a 2009 study by Lon Pritchett of Harvard Kennedy School, who wrote this in a paper. And he says about, is India a flailing state, not a failing state, in which the head, that is the elite institutions at the national and in some states level, remain sound and functional, but this head is no longer reliably connected via nerves and sinews to its own limbs. The brains of the Indian state can formulate excellent policies and programs in nearly every domain, yet the capability of the Indian state to implement programs and policies is weak in police, tax collection, education, health, power, water supply. In nearly every routine service, there's rampant absenteeism, indifference, incompetence, and corruption. And that's such a powerful indictment of the capacity of state. And somewhere in your book, you say, the first thought before any new policy is do no harm.
That should be the first test. That's the first test.
That's the first test, that do no harm, and at least implement existing policies before you announce a new policy. And I'm reminded of a conversation that I had over Jerry Rao's book, which is called The Indian Conservative. And I remember asking him, I said, the Indian conservative is a bit like Gandhi's question about Western civilization. It's a good idea. But where are the Indian conservatives when you look at the political spectrum in economic terms? His answer was that Prime Minister Modi's government is the most economic conservative government that we've had. And my response was, well, then can we try and close down maybe a dozen departments of the government that serve no useful purpose? Now that Air India has also been sold, is there a rationale for the Ministry of Civil Aviation with the entire superstructure? Do we need a Ministry of Information and Broadcasting? Broadcasting in this day and age with the connotations that it carries. And when the minister goes abroad, there's no equivalent, because most countries do not have a Ministry of Information and Broadcasting. Most countries do not have a Ministry of Civil Aviation. UAE has Emirates Airlines and Etihad Airlines as two of the largest carriers, and Fly Dubai. It does not have a Ministry of Civil Aviation. There's a department headed by a joint secretary level officer in the Ministry of Economy. And he deals with all of the regulatory issues and the bilateral civil aviation agreements, and that's about it. So isn't there a case for smaller government that we need to make, not just less government, but smaller government?
So actually, I would make the argument that the Indian government is actually not a large government. If you look at total tax to GDP, tax to GDP in India is actually very low relative to Europe. I mean, our tax to GDP ratio is has been stuck between 10 and 12% for many, many years, right? If you look at a typical European country, it's closer to somewhere between 40 and 55%. So our government is actually not a large government. I mean, this may be surprising, but it's not a large government relative to other countries. The question is, what's the total scope of government work? What we need to limit is the total scope of government work, not the size of government. use the size that we have and focus it on those fewer things which only the state can do and do them a lot better. I mean, that's what we need to do more than anything else. So I'm not actually a believer in smaller government. I'm actually a believer in better, more focused, more limited government.
So if we were to combine that thought with what I'm saying to close a dozen ministries or government departments.
It would be perfect. I think you could go much further than a dozen. We have, what's the total number? We have 80 central government ministers. We probably need 15.
90% of steel is made in the private sector today.
Yeah.
We have a Ministry of Steel.
Yeah. We have a Ministry of Pharmaceuticals.
We have a Ministry of Pharmaceuticals. Can you name one government pharmaceutical company that you would happily go and consume its medicines? Okay.
Sanjoy says 14 ministries that look after the creative industries and probably haven't created anything.
So I would argue that a smaller government in my terms means closing down the irrelevant parts of the government or the unproductive parts of government and redeploying those resources, human resources, financial resources, into healthcare, education, building infrastructure, things that only government needs to do and can do.
Yeah, exactly.
You raise a very interesting point, Naushad, in your book about cooperative federalism. And this was a theme that the Prime Minister articulated at length when he came into power. We saw a very successful example in the fact that GST was rolled out despite opposition by painstakingly building a consensus with the state governments. And
it was passed by every state legislature.
Every state legislature and the federal...
Both BJP ruled and opposition ruled. Yeah.
And yet, we saw the Farm Bill not going through. What do you think happened?
Well, I think, see, for GST, it required a constitutional amendment. Because it required a constitutional amendment, there was a need then for a 2/3 majority in Parliament. So the opposition was necessary to take on board. The farm bills did not need a constitutional amendment. It could be done with an absolute majority. So there was no reaching out to the opposition. But we saw what happened with the bills. My view, as I say in the book, I supported the farm laws. I thought they would actually be good for agricultural productivity in the long run. They could have been actually worked through in a much more effective way by letting the opposition have their say, not passing the laws on a Sunday on a voice vote with a show of hands. Let people criticize, argue, debate, because once you've expressed your view and you've been heard, you may not still vote in favor of the rule or the new law, but at least you feel that your opposition has been heard. And I think that's important in our kind of polity. We need to respect people who disagree with us and hear them. And if we hear them and understand them, it doesn't mean we agree with them. It just means we've heard them and understood them and we respect them, even if we don't agree with them.
And it's a point that you make very powerfully in your book about the importance of dissent and accepting dissent. And I think I love the line that you used. Criticism is patriotism. It's almost like a patriotic duty of the citizen to critique the government. And I was speaking at a session yesterday about Jallianwala Bagh because my grandfather was present at the Jallianwala Bagh when the massacre happened. And I was reminded, reading your book, that the people in Jallianwala Bagh were protesting against the Rowlatt Act, which was really a predecessor of our Anti-Sedition Act, which is a predecessor of the UAPA that we now have. And the fact that despite promises, not the Vajpayee government, not the Manmohan Singh government, and not the Modi government have bothered to take the law off the statute book. So what is it that governments get they're very passionate about it when they are in opposition. But when they come into power, it seems to be a non-issue.
So when governments are in opposition, the law is used against them, right? And it's used to silence them. So they're passionate about getting rid of it. When they're in power, they decide that it's time to return the favor instead of getting rid of the law. And I hope that changes, because I think what we've seen in these last few years is actually the overuse, let me use the word overuse, not misuse, but overuse of many institutions to actually harass the opposition, but also anyone who was inconvenient. And I think with that overuse, hopefully there's enough keenness to next time we have a different government in power, they get rid of those statutes. And or maybe the current government has enough confidence in itself to get rid of them anyway. Because these are, sedition, remember, sedition as a law was passed by the British as a way of protecting British rule against Indians. And it's still being used 75 years after independence to protect the government against its own citizens. Doesn't make sense.
Yeah, which then brings me to a point that you make in your book. You took on a comment by a senior official who said part of the problem in our delivering on our potential is too much democracy in India. Is that an alibi, or is that a genuine constraint or a roadblock in meeting people's expectations? There is also the perennial temptation to use China for purposes of saying we can't do what China has done in building infrastructure. And you say, well, why can't we build a flyover in 4 weeks? So
first of all, the argument that I make in the book is that if we try to be like China, we will fail. We will be a third-rate version of China, right? We should be like India. So, and if we want to be like India, then what does that mean? That means indeed relying on democracy, and democracy is not just free and fair elections that we have in abundance. It's also believing in the independence of institutions and letting those institutions get on with doing their job. Whether those institutions are the Election Commission of India, or it's the Supreme Courts and High Courts and the court system more widely, or whether it's private institutions, civil service institutions, it's educational institutions, research institutions, it doesn't matter. Institutions in general need to be able to get on with their job. If they do, between them collectively, the institutions set the rules under which we all operate. And then you don't need a super wise government to decide what's right or wrong. So I actually say that in India, we don't have too much democracy, we don't have enough. We need more, enough democracy to actually include more people in these participative processes, such that each citizen and each institution can operate independently. That's how I think we will beat China, actually, because if we try to play China's games on its terms, we will lose. But let them play on our terms.
Absolutely. And one final question, Naushad, before we open the floor to the public, to our audience. You have a lovely chapter on culture and building unity in diversity and about India's soft power. And as a diplomat who's former diplomat who's served in 8 or 9 countries, I can say that we have not only experienced India's soft power in different geographies, but shamelessly used it as well for a national purpose. The impact of Bollywood, the impact of yoga, the impact of music, the fact of an Indian democracy are real constituents of soft power.
Yep.
But because we are here in Jaipur at the JLF, I just can't resist reading the final para and a half that you wrote in your chapter on culture and building unity and diversity. And I hope the audience can connect with that. And in January 2020, protests against the Citizenship Amendment Act rocked Delhi. The same month, my niece and I were at the Jaipur Literature Festival. CAA saw the Indian government at its worst, passing a terrible law using a brute majority, stifling debate, deterring and delaying constitutional questions being taken up by the Supreme Court, and using the Delhi police to harass peaceful protesters. My niece and I went to Jaipur depressed. A few days at JLF was invigorating. We attended session upon session that were demonstrations in free speech and critical thought. And the audience, the 400,000 who make JLF the world's largest literary festival, consisted overwhelmingly of young people, especially college students. They had done their homework, had read the books closely, and asked perceptive and specific questions of the many authors who were wandering around. They renewed our hope. We would be in safe hands if the young attendees at JLF could come to represent India's future. So just a last word from you, Naushad, on what do you think JLF represents?
I think it represents just this. It represents wonderful sessions. But you know, the wonderful sessions, you can get wonderful sessions elsewhere too. Maybe not the same richness, but you can get wonderful sessions elsewhere. What you can't get is the wonderful sessions combined with such a wonderful audience. And I think that's what makes JLF so unique and so powerful. And that's why I'm so delighted that it's not only restarted as a physical program this year, thanks to all the work that Sanjoy and William and Namita have put in, but also online, because this is a way of opening the festival out to so many more. I mean, I heard an incredible number, of 20 million people. So, I mean, this is wonderful because that's that engagement. And I hope that as in future editions of JLF, we can go back to many more young people being present at the venue as restrictions on movement and social distancing and so on also ebb. So that's what to me is unique about JLF. I think it's a terrific way of bringing together people who represent the future with great content and great ideas and great discussion.
So let the power of ideas flourish at Jaipur. Let me take questions from the audience. Okay, gentlemen, right in front.
Okay, let's begin this questionnaire in the spirit in which you finished by an old young man, okay, who's been a midnight child also, being born in 47. The question is this. You began by saying that the problem, all these government regulation problems and all, we know them all, frankly. The question is, you said, what's the requirement? Jobs, jobs, jobs. That's what you began with. And you also said that the government is going to go out of business and then private industry is going to take all this up, okay, like Air India. The question is, most jobs today are actually people cutting. I hope you'll realize this. Today, there's a cashier in a bank, there's somebody else, but you are paying online. So there are two jobs which are gone. All jobs are reducing. So the question is, how do you reconcile this?
I get this, and it's an argument that has been made from the time that the light bulb was invented and it put out the candle makers out of business, or when the steam engine was invented and it put the horse carriage out of business. I mean, that's a progression of technology and industry, and I think that's how societies progress. And there is a pain of transition between those stages that is quite real. But Naushad actually covers this in some length in his book, so I'll hand it over to him.
Sure. So, if you look at, as Navdeep said, since the Industrial Revolution, there have been protests against automation. The first protests were by a group of people called the Luddites in England. against highly productive spinning machinery, because spinners were being put out of jobs by the thousand through these new industrial innovations. This is going back to the late 18th century. Yeah? And they went around the country actually breaking machinery because they felt so threatened. And Luddite is a term that has continued because this group was supposedly led by some mystical character named John Ludd. So it's been around for a long time. What actually ended up happening? Many more jobs in the total got created. Does that mean that individuals didn't lose their jobs? No, individuals do lose their jobs because particular jobs change. You no longer need them. You no longer need typing pools. A friend of mine used to run a company and he advertised his company as the world's largest typewriter manufacturer. This is not something to be proud of, right? Because if the world stops buying typewriters, why do you want to be the world's largest typewriter manufacturer? So you need to be able to move with changes in technology. What matters is the net effect on employment positive? And second, for people who are affected by unemployment, who are thrown out of jobs, how do you ensure that you give them the ability to compete in that economy with the changes in jobs that are then demanded? Look at the world today. Look at the world today versus 10 years ago, 50 years ago, 100 years ago. There are more jobs today than 10 years ago, more jobs 10 years ago than 50 years ago, more jobs 50 years ago than 100 years ago. And the jobs are not only better, they're better quality. We not only have more jobs, better quality jobs. So the jobs are there. The jobs may be different and demand different skill sets. That's where the education system comes in. We better invest in much better education systems such that each individual has the ability, they're enabled to actually participate in the modern economy. That's the single big role of the government from a positive economic long-term perspective. Enable the population at large to participate in the economy productively. That's the single big thing that we have to do. And if we do that, and then we have some safety nets so that people who are thrown out of jobs are supported until they can find a new job, then you're fine. Then you have a dynamic engine for long-term development and growth.
And there's a wonderful chapter in the book, actually, which you have to pick up and read about the new education policy, about the skilling programs of government, of the ambitions of National Skills Development Corporation to skill people in the upcoming jobs that are needed, and how the ambition of NSDC has actually been scaled back from 500 million originally to a much smaller
10 million
number now. But let me take another question. The gentleman over there. Yes, gray shirt.
Sir, taking this job argument further, as I'm myself in a government job, I'm Additional Commissioner GST, and previously as Joint Secretary Finance, one of the major roles I had was to sanction more and more government jobs. You just said that government is not supposed to create jobs, but fortunately or unfortunately, we are in a democracy and we get votes. The politicians get votes when they create more jobs, whether or not they are required. You said we should shut down civil aviation. Politicians want to bring back Ukrainians through our airlines because that is a popular measure. So how do we reconcile this in a democracy?
So it's not easy. It's easy for us as observers to make recommendations, and I make no bones of the fact that actually playing a role of political leadership is a tough job, especially in our country, whether at the national or at the state level. It's a tough job. But one of the key requirements, it seems to me, of policymakers is to explain to people what they are doing and why they are doing it. And I think people understand. I think people understand when they are told why something is being done that may seem troubling in the short run, but this is the medium term or longer term objective. This is what we are trying to achieve. Take GST as an area, right? We used to have a central excise department. We had octroi in different states, etc., right? Replaced by GST. Major reform, major progress for the country, right? Selling that to people is exactly what politics is all about, and saying this is why it's an important thing. And we did exactly that. We sold it at the state level, we sold it at the national level, and people listened and heard and said, yes, this makes sense. And there may be some issues in the short run, but in the long run, it's fine. We did not do the same thing with the farm laws. And that was the big mistake. We said, we've got a majority, we can pass the laws. The job of democracy is not pass the law. The job of democracy is get the law implemented in an effective way. And getting those laws implemented effectively is what I think politics is all about. So explain. And if you've explained 10 times, explain for the 11th time when someone asks you the same question again.
Okay, I'm getting the signal that we are almost out of time, but okay, I will overrule him and take one last question.
Thank you, sir. So my question is that United States pays a much more focus on liberal education, whereas in India, it's not much high liberal education. So what are your views on liberal education in India?
I'm a very strong proponent. I believe that one of the things that actually has damaged us as a country is our overwhelming focus on professional education. I have no problem with, great that we produce 1 million engineers a year. That's terrific, right? But we need to produce a lot more historians, a lot more people who worry about literature, a lot more anthropologists, a lot more sociologists. We need to have this much more liberal education that will give people the ability to understand the context in which we live and engage in public debate and engage in public issues. So I'm a strong proponent of a much stronger, bigger, larger liberal education footprint for the country.
Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, great book. If you're interested in government policy, what government should do, please pick up a copy and read it.
Ladies and gentlemen, a riveting session about democracy and so much more. The struggle and the promise. Naushad Forbes in conversation with Navdeep Suri. May we request the speakers to please accept a small token of our love and appreciation. We try and give matching scarves to the outfits. We also take care of the style element here at the festival. Thank you so much. In case you want to get your books signed, Naushad. Book signing, front lawn, right behind you. So you can make your way over there and ask more budding questions about democracy and so much more. Yet again, thank you so much. We will be back with our next session very, very shortly. Stonekeeper, Khak Mein Suratein.